So I think outside of the marriage monasticism question, there are other vocations that one could do, and one of the bigger callings is the priesthood. So, how do you what advice would you have to give? How could you tell if someone you think is maybe called to the priesthood?
Well, in many cases, the call will come from the church. Not necessarily in every case, but very often, what will happen is that the person's priest will take them aside and say, "Have you ever thought about serving the church in this capacity or something like that?" And so if that initial call comes from the church, then I think already that's something to take very seriously. To give very uh, wholehearted consideration to. If it's something that comes from our own desires, that's not necessarily like a sign that it's immediately wrong, but it is something that I would, advise to be treated, with more suspicion, because people can often have the idea that the priesthood is something different than what it really is, or that it's going to be a source of personal power or glory or authority or something like that. Even if we're not conscious of that, that desire can be within us. The passion of pride and ambition is something that everyone has to some extent or another. And so any kind of gravitation towards a position that we feel rightly or wrongly might satisfy that desire is something to be cautious about. So I would say, ask carefully, why is it that I'm thinking about the priesthood? Is it because, I love the church so much and I want to spend every moment that I can in the divine services, and I'm trying to go out of my way each day to find ways to help people come to Christ in whatever way makes sense for me in the context of my current life. If it's an expression out of piety and faith and prayer and love for God, then I think it's something to take to your spiritual father and say, I have this desire. What do you think? And talk about it. If when we're being honest with ourselves, we instead find that it's more that we like the idea of ourselves as a certain kind of spiritual person, or having a certain kind of position within the church, then, be much more cautious about it. If it's persistent, it never hurts to ask your spiritual father. But be honest with him also that, hey, I'm worried maybe this is, because of some pride within me or something like that. And again, he'll be able to help you work through all that and find out another thing that I would say is if you go into it, with a palpable sense that you're going to be sacrificing something, then again, that's a much more trustworthy sort of mindset to be going into it with, because ultimately that's the case. I remember after the bishop and abbot here said that he wanted me to be ordained, I spoke later about it with the priest who baptized me, and he said, just remember one thing: the only thing that the church has to offer you in the priesthood is the cross, but through the cross joy has come to all the world. And I found that to be absolutely true. I mean, the priesthood absolutely is a cross. And if we go into it with the idea that it's something else, we're going to have a very hard time at minimum, if not, possibly do a lot of damage to ourselves and even to others, God forbid. So again, if this decision is being approached like every other decision from the context of, how can I, first of all, become united with Christ, but, also therefore live out a life of sacrificial love for the people around me. If that's the basis for it, then if it's God's will, he'll open the doors and it'll happen. That's another thing that I would say. It's like, if this is something that we really, are having to push, be wary of it. If you're like hounding people about, trying to get into a seminary and they're kind of dragging their feet or something like that, well, then maybe just back off, at least for a time. When we, which is not the same thing as it's going to be hard work to do it. You know what I mean? Like, of course, it's going to involve a lot of hard work. I'm not saying like if you have to make any effort towards it, then don't do it. Like, that's certainly not it. But if you really have the feeling that you're trying to impose your will to become a priest, that's very dangerous. So again, the most important thing is to be, open and to discuss all these things with your spiritual father, not just, the thing itself, but also what are my thoughts and feelings about it, the good and the bad. Be completely open about it so that they can give you the best advice possible. But if it's something that God is calling us to, the doors will open, and if it's not, then look for something else that the doors are open to, I would say.
Right. So as far as other potential vocations, there's iconographer, podicellity, choir director, catechist, etc. What are some indicators that someone might be called to one of those roles, as opposed to marriage, monasticism, priesthood? And additionally, just kind of as a practical question, what would the next steps look like for someone wanting to pursue one of those roles?
So I'm not sure that I caught all the things that you mentioned. It seems to me that most of them are sort of supplemental vocations that can take place in the context either of monasticism or marriage, or whatever else sort of the main life path that we take is.
Right.
And a lot of them, I think, frankly, have to do with the talents and skills that God has given to us. If we have a good voice, it's probably a good idea to ask our priest, or whoever's in charge of the choir at our parish, hey, I have some experience singing. Could the choir use some help? Similarly with, really any other need. So again, I think, these decisions shouldn't necessarily be made in the abstract so much as they should be made based on looking at what does my parish need? If it's obvious that they're having trouble getting people to read the Psalms, then maybe volunteer yourself to read the Psalter. If it's clear that the choir has trouble getting people to sing, if it seems like, the church is always dirty, maybe volunteer to help the church warden or to become the church warden. Look for what real needs exist in the church, and if these match up with your either intrinsic abilities or the time that you have available, whatever it is, then ask the priest if he would like you to do that. And if it requires training, if it requires further study, they'll let you know for sure how to go about acquiring that. And this is something it's going to be different in different churches and jurisdictions and things. Some have music schools that they can send you to really learn how to put the services together well, different things like that. But all of that, again, God will open these doors for you if this is something that you need. Again, I would say, talk to your spiritual father, look at the real world. Our enemy in everything is really being in our own head in the spiritual life, making decisions that are not connected with reality, that are not connected with the advice of our spiritual father or other people who are whose lives we want to emulate, basically. One of the oldest sayings in Christian monasticism is the person who has himself for a spiritual father has a fool for a spiritual father. That really, even if the decision that you make is quote unquote right, still nothing good is going to come of it, because it's something that is existing apart from a lived relationship with God. Like, again, that's the root of all of these things. Like what is proceeding from our real, actual connection with Christ and his church, and what is just our own desires or our own opinions or our own instincts about what our lives or the spiritual life are supposed to be like somehow. Being rooted in reality. Like, I mean, I don't know if this is something that's because our society has become so dependent on the internet and technology, and so much of our lives have become mediated in these sort of virtual or fake ways of living. And, of course, some of us are going to be more inclined towards this temptation than others, but it's so easy for us to be living basically in a mental, copy of real life. And those copies can be quite good and quite sophisticated and really, trick us into thinking that we are living in the real world. But we're really, sort of observers of our own life rather than living the actual life that God has given to us on a day-to-day basis. So I think just being present and aware, and looking for God's providence, because it's something that we're not going to, just be probably driving down the road and then all of a sudden, we're going to be hit on the head with what God's providence is calling us to do. We have to be looking for it. We have to be asking ourselves, whenever anything happens in our life, what is God trying to give me through this? What is he trying to teach me through this? pray about these things, talk to your spiritual father about these things. We have to really be actively looking for God's providence, God's hand. And of course, this isn't to say that we're always going to have the answers to those questions. I mean, probably most of the time we won't be able to answer the question, but we should be asking these questions. We should be looking for God's providence, even though most of the time, we're not going to be able to understand it till maybe years, decades, maybe even after our earthly lives are over. We're not going to be able to fully understand these things until then, if at all. But if we don't even get into the habit of looking for God's hand in the world and in our lives, then we're just going to be wrapped up in something else entirely, more likely than not.
Mm-hmm. So one question that came to mind as you were talking is kind of the inverse of all the questions that I've been asking is, how do we know if we're running away from the will of God?
Mm. Well, that's a much harder question to answer, I think.
I think if I can predict what you might say,
sure.
It's kind of go through the open door is essentially kind of go through the open door and follow what your priest is advising you.
There's an extent.
I don't want to put words in your mouth. Go ahead.
Well, no, I mean, you were quoting things that I've said over and over, so no risk of that. But certainly, I think that's a part of it. But there's also a sense in which if things are too open or too easy, that's also a warning sign. Mm-hmm. I'll tell you a story that really struck me and has stayed with me and has seemed relevant to many situations since then. Maybe you already know it. It's a story about St. Ambrose of Milan. He was of course, a bishop of the early church, same time as St. Augustine, but he was traveling through the countryside around Milan with his deacon. And as they were traveling, they passed the estate of a landowner who saw the bishop and invited him to come in and dine with him. And so they said, "Okay, well, thank you very much." And they stopped in to have a meal with this landowner. And as they were waiting for the meal to be ready, St. Ambrose was talking to the landowner and asked, how are things going? How has your life been? He said, "Oh, glory be to God. Everything is wonderful. God has blessed me very richly." And he said, "Well, how are your children doing?" He said, "Oh, thank God, they're wonderful children. They've grown up in the fear of God. They have their own families. It's very beautiful. So how about your farm, your estate?" And he said, "Thank God they're prospering. The harvest is coming in richly. He's given me, everything that I need." This goes on for a little while. And finally, St. Ambrose turns to his deacon and says, "We have to depart. We can't eat here because God does not dwell in this house." Which is, of course, really an astonishing thing to hear. And I think we need to maybe think about that a little bit. It seems to me that the reason that he said that was the only reason why a loving God allows suffering in our life, or hardship or difficulty, or the cross in whatever form it is in our life, is because it is through these things that we can grow, deepen in our faith, be healed of what ails us spiritually, become more like Him, become capable of real love, to become capable of being who we were created to be, who we really want to be in our deepest hearts. It's really only through sufferings and difficulties that our passions can be stripped away, that we can learn to turn away from the very things that are causing us these pains to begin with, our passions, our sins, our mistakes. But if God sees that we're so stubborn, and we're so set in our ways that no suffering will do us that good, that we'll reject that lesson, we'll reject that gift, then God's not going to just torture us meaninglessly. If this suffering won't be able to benefit us and heal our souls, He's not going to just punish us with this for no reason. And so what St. Ambrose was saying was that ultimately, even though it looked externally like everything was going well for this man, that ultimately he had so hardened himself to God's providence, to God's love, that because hardship and difficulty wouldn't have done him any good, that simply God left him alone. God left him alone. And so if we've acquired what seems to us like peace, and that, we're going through all of the open doors and everything's calm, but we haven't really repented deeply. We haven't really learned to live a life of sincere prayer and of profound love and self-sacrifice, that to me is one of the biggest warning signs that we're not listening to God's voice, that we are closing ourselves off to the gifts and the lessons and the opportunities for healing and salvation that God wants to give to us. Not always. I mean, so basically what I'm saying is like, and I forget which saint or holy father said it, but they, many of them said things, along these lines, but one said something to the effect of, basically beware of any kind of peace that you think you have before you've been crucified. Because peace absolutely is one of the most profound goals of the Christian life. And it is what, it's a gift that God wants to give to us, but it's a gift that we can't obtain in its truth until the old man is dead. And so if we feel like we have it, but the old man is also still alive, then really it basically means that the old man is just getting his way, so that would probably be the main thing that I would say as far as closing ourselves off to God's will is that it's that famous book from the 20th century, like why do bad things happen to good people or something like that. It's like the question of the inverse of why do good things happen to bad people,
right?
Like really this is the answer. It's because they have no interest in God, they have no interest in loving the people around them, and they have so little interest in these things that again, if God were to allow them the same difficulties and sufferings that we experience in our lives as Christians, it would just be torturing them. It would do them no good, and God's not like that. So if our lives are too easy, if things are going too well, we should maybe step back and ask ourselves, well, why is this? Because there's only two answers. There's one that we've become so humble and obedient and submissive to God's will and have so much faith in his love that we're capable of accepting everything that happens to us, no matter how difficult and painful, with perfect peace, or God's left us alone. Those are the choices. Right. So,
yeah, it can definitely be difficult discerning that, because on one hand, the prosperity gospel is something that is just kind of implicit in our culture, that if good things happen, then that means God's blessing you, and that a good thing is good. But the Orthodox take is sometimes not always. That's not always the case. And
it's a really good point. Like I should just real quick jump on what you just said to make it clear that I'm not being some kind of absolutist, that the Christian life is supposed to be like all suffering and misery all the time, or something like that. There's always going to be a mix of blessings and consolations, because God gives us what we need, at any given time. And sometimes we need consolation, sometimes we need peace, sometimes we need comfort and to experience the love of others, for example. Sometimes we need the opposite. So it's not that we need to just be torturing ourselves or to be hoping that our lives are constantly miserable or anything like that. It's when we go to either extreme, like that's when we know something's wrong. If our lives are all pleasure all the time, something's wrong. If it's all suffering and misery all the time, something is also wrong. It means that we're really not looking at these things the way that we should, or that we're torturing ourselves out of some misguided sense that God just wants pain for its own sake or something. So anyway, sorry, keep going with what you were saying.
No, that was actually pretty much just where I was going anyway, because it's not that blessings are bad, but it's not that blessings are always necessarily a good thing, but also things that come up in life that are difficult, sometimes that's for the better. And so, as with a lot of things in Orthodoxy, you kind of have to find the balance. You have to find the middle path, the royal path.
Absolutely.
So, well, this has been really good. I think there's been a lot of really good practical advice that you've given for people. Just as we wrap up here, what kind of parting advice do you have for those seeking to discern their place in the church?
I would just reiterate, what I said at the beginning, that no matter what it is that God is calling us to, and at whatever point in our lives He will choose to make that clear, the best thing that we can be doing now to prepare for it is simply to become, the best Christians that we can be at this moment in time, and that, that's expressed through prayer, through going to church, through reading spiritual books. But, just as importantly, if not more importantly, loving the people around us, forgiving the people around us, learning to show mercy and to overlook the faults of people around us. And I think this, this is really, much harder than many other things in the Christian. I mean, you can look, for example, some people, these Orthodox, they fast all the time, it's like, how can, but, you look around, how many people are vegetarians or vegans, for some other reason, either because they care about animal rights or for some diet reason or something like that. Like, people eat much more strictly than Orthodox do. You can look at other religious traditions who, as St. Isaac the Syrian said, can oftentimes put us to shame as Orthodox Christians in many ways by the intensity of their efforts. Ultimately, none of the things that we do externally in our Christian lives will profit us anything, like St. Paul says, if we don't have love. And ultimately, all of these outward efforts are much, much easier than acquiring real love, real mercy, real forgiveness. To love your enemies, like that is the mark of a Christian. Regardless of how long your prayer roll is, or how strictly you fast, or how many hours a day you spend in church, or how many books of theology you've read, to be able to love your enemies, like that's what Christ said. By this shall all men know that you're my disciples, by the love you have one for another. And of course, also for the love that we have for those who hate us and wrong us and persecute us. And really, even if we're complete failures in all other ways in our Christian life, if at least we can forgive the people who've wronged us, then God tells us we have nothing to worry about. He says everything will be forgiven to you. If you show mercy, mercy will be shown to you. Like, this is the shortcut to sanctification, because again, this is who God is. He's merciful. He makes his sun to shine on the good and the evil, the just and the unjust, the grateful and the ungrateful. And so the most important thing for us as Christians at any point in our spiritual life, but especially at the beginning, to lay this as the foundation, is really, what did Christ say to the Pharisees? Go learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. I think if we hold that in mind and we pursue that with all of our heart, then with God's help, we'll be able to avoid a lot of the pitfalls that young converts can oftentimes fall into, that I myself fell into, to become fixated on outward forms or theology or whatever. I mean, because it's this whole new world of beautiful, wonderful things that are open to us, and of course, all these things are good and wonderful, of course, in themselves. But if we forget that ultimately all these things are only means to the end of acquiring the love of Christ, of being united with Christ in his self-sacrificing love, then the demons will be able to distract us and trick us and, make us think that we're living an exalted spiritual life when really we're living, basically just because we like the idea of ourself as a spiritual person. But there's really, there can be a counterfeit for many things in the spiritual life. But I don't think there can really be a counterfeit for love and forgiveness for our enemies, especially. So if we put this in the first place, then it's the warning and the promise that the Apostle John gave in his epistle. If how can you see God, or how can you love God who you haven't seen if you don't love your brother who you have seen? The converse of that is, if we learn to love our brothers, we'll be able to see God, we'll be able to love God, we'll be able to know God. And that's what the Christian life is all about. That's what the Orthodox life is all about. Whether priest or lay, whether married or monastic, whatever it is, it's ultimately with that goal in mind. And if we keep that goal in mind and struggle towards it with all our hearts, then all of these more external decisions, outward decisions, I think for the most part, with God's grace and with the advice of our spiritual father, all these things will fall into place.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I think just as before I conclude here, I'll remind anyone listening that if they want to go visit Holy Cross Monastery, I'll have a link to your website. And also, if they want to donate to help the building of the new church or any other kind of projects that you guys have going on, that they can do that, because that's important, because you guys can't get by without it. So
thank you so much. And I apologize for my tendency to ramble. It's not very monastic of me, so I appreciate you being patient with me.
No worries. I mean, you had a lot of good advice to give for people, and I think it's important for people to hear what you had to say. So I appreciate your time.
Well, thank you very much.